as a reporter in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. I encountered singular individuals of varying creeds, religions, races, and nationalities who majestically rose up to defy the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. Some of them are dead, some of them are forgotten, most of them are unknown. These individuals, despite their vast cultural differences, had common traits: a profound commitment to the truth, incorruptibility, courage, a distrust of power, a hatred of violence, and a deep empathy that was extended to people who were different from them, even to people defined by the dominant culture as the enemy. They are the most remarkable men and women I met in my 20 years as a foreign correspondent. You have heard of some, such as Václav Havel, whom I and other reporters met most evenings in the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague during the 1989 Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Others, no less great, you may not know, such as the Jesuit priest Ignacio Ellacuría, assassinated in El Salvador in 1989. And then there are those ordinary people, although, as the writer V.S. Pritchett said, no people are ordinary, who risked their lives in wartime to shelter and protect those of an opposing religion or ethnicity being persecuted and hunted. And to some of these ordinary people, I owe my life. To resist radical evil is to endure a life that by the standards of the wider society is a failure. It is to defy injustice at the cost of your career, your reputation, your financial solvency, and at times, your life. It is to be a lifelong heretic. It is to accept that the dominant culture, even the liberal elites, will push you to the margins and attempt to discredit not only what you do, but your character. When I returned to the newsroom at the New York Times after being booed off a commencement stage in 2003 for denouncing the invasion of Iraq and being publicly reprimanded by the paper for my stance against the war, reporters and editors I had known and worked with for 15 years lowered their heads or turned away when I was nearby. Ruling institutions, the state, the press, the church, the courts, academia mouth the language of morality, but serve the structures of power, no matter how venal, which provide them with money, status, and authority. In times of national distress, one has only to look at Nazi Germany. All these institutions, including the Academy, are complicit through their silence or their active collaboration with radical evil. And our own institutions, which have surrendered to corporate power and the utopian ideology of neoliberalism, are no different. Reinhold Niebuhr labeled the capacity to defy the forces of repression a sublime madness in the soul. Niebuhr wrote that nothing but madness will do battle with malignant power and spiritual wickedness in high places. This sublime madness, as Niebuhr understood, is dangerous, but it is vital. Without it, truth is obscured. And Niebuhr also understood that traditional liberalism was a useless farce in moments of extremity. Liberalism, Niebuhr said, lacks the spirit of enthusiasm, not to say fanaticism, which is so necessary to move the world out of its beaten tracks. It is too intellectual and too little emotional to be an efficient force in history. This sublime madness is the essential quality for a life of resistance. It is the knowledge that when you stand with the oppressed, you are treated like the oppressed. It is the acceptance that although empirically all that we struggle to achieve during our lifetime may be worse, our struggle validates itself. Daniel Berrigan told me that faith is the belief that the good draws to it the good. The Buddhists call this karma, but he said for us, we did not know where it went. We trusted that it went somewhere, but we did not know where. We are called to do the good, or at least the good so far as we can determine it, and then let it go. As Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. They know that, as Immanuel Kant wrote, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And this means that, like Socrates, we must come to a place where it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. We must at once see and act, and give it what it means to see. This will require the surmounting of despair, not by reason, but by faith. I saw in the conflicts I covered the power of this faith, which lies outside of any religious or philosophical creed. This faith is what Havel, in his great essay, The Power of the Powerless, calls living in truth. Living in truth exposes the corruption, lies, and deceit of the state. It is a refusal to be part of the charade. You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career, Havel wrote. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. The dissident does not operate in the realm of genuine power at all. He or she is not seeking power. He or she has no desire for office and does not gather votes. He or she does not attempt to charm the public. He or she offers nothing and promises nothing. He or she can offer, if anything, only their own skin, and they offer it solely because they have no other way of affirming the truth they stand for. Their actions simply articulate their dignity as a citizen, regardless of the cost. The long, long road of sacrifice and suffering that led to the collapse of the communist regimes stretched back decades. Those who made change possible, who had discarded all notions of the practical. They did not try to reform the Communist Party. They did not attempt to work within the system. They did not know what, if anything, their tiny protests, ignored by the state-controlled media, would accomplish. They were marginalized and persecuted, and yet these rebels, dissidents, poets, playwrights, actors, singers, writers, finally triumphed over state and military power. They drew the good to the good. They triumphed because, however cowed and broken the people around them appeared, their message of defiance did not go unheard. It did not go unseen. The steady drumbeat of rebellion exposed the dead hand of authority and the corruption of the state. I stood with hundreds of thousands of rebellious Czechs in 1989 on a cold winter night in Prague's Wenceslas Square as the singer Marta Kubashova approached the balcony of the Melantric building. Kubashova had been banished from the airwaves in 1968 after the Soviet invasion for her anthem of defiance, Prayer for Marta. Her entire catalog, including more than 200 singles, had been confiscated and destroyed by the state. She had disappeared from public view. Her voice that night suddenly flooded the square. Pressing around me were throngs of students, most of whom had not been born when she had vanished. They began to sing the words of the anthem. There were tears running down their faces. It was then that I understood the power of rebellion. It was then that I knew that no act of rebellion, however futile it appears in the moment, is wasted. The walls of Prague that winter were covered with posters depicting Jan Palach. Palach, a university student, set himself on fire in Wenceslas Square on January 16th, 1969, in the middle of the day, to protest the crushing of the country's democracy movement. He died of his burns 3 days later. The state swiftly attempted to erase his act from national memory. Pollock's gravesite, which became a shrine, saw the communist authorities exhume his body, cremate his remains, and ship them to his mother with the provision that his ashes could not be placed in a cemetery. But it did not work. His defiance remained a rallying cry. His sacrifice spurred the students in the winter of 1989 to act. Prague's Red Army Square, shortly after I left for Bucharest to cover the uprising in Romania, was renamed Jan Pollock Square, and 10,000 people went to the dedication. We, like those who opposed the long night of communism, no longer have any mechanisms within the formal structures of power that will protect or advance our rights. We too have undergone a coup d'etat, carried out not by the stone-faced leaders of a monolithic communist party, but by the corporate state. We may feel, in the face of the ruthless corporate destruction of our nation, our culture, and our ecosystem, powerless and weak, but we are not. We have a power that terrifies our corporate masters. Any act of rebellion, no matter how few people show up or how heavily it is censored, chips away at corporate power. Any act of rebellion keeps alive the embers for larger movements that follow us. It passes on another narrative. It will, as the state consumes itself, attract wider and wider numbers. Perhaps this will not happen in our lifetimes, but if we persist, we will keep this possibility alive. If we do not, it will die. Dr. Rio and Albert Camus' novel The Plague is not driven by ideology. He is driven by empathy, the duty to minister to suffering, to those who suffer, no matter the cost. Empathy, or what the Russian novelist Vasily Grossman called simple human kindness, becomes in all despotisms a subversive act. To act on this empathy, the empathy for families terrorized by our war machine in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. The empathy for undocumented mothers and fathers being torn from their children on the streets of our cities. The empathy for Muslims who are demonized and banned from our shores, fleeing the wars we created. The empathy for poor people of color, gunned down by police in our streets and locked in cages. The empathy for girls and women trafficked into prostitution. The empathy for the earth that gives us life and is being contaminated and poisoned for profit. This empathy becomes political and even dangerous. A life of faith is a life of confrontation. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, in instructing catechumens, wrote, "The dragon sits by the side of the road, watching those who pass. Beware, lest he devour you. We go to the Father of souls, but it is necessary to pass by the dragon. No matter what form the dragon may take, it is of this mysterious passage past him or into his jaws that stories of any depth will always be concerned to tell," Flannery O'Connor wrote. And this being the case, it requires considerable courage at any time, in any country, not to turn away from the storyteller. Accept sorrow, for who cannot be profoundly sorrowful at the state of our nation, the world, and the planet? But know that in resistance there is a balm that leads to wisdom, and if not joy, a strange, transcendent happiness. Know that if we resist, we keep hope alive. "My faith has been tempered in hell," wrote Vasily Grossman in Life and Fate. "My faith has emerged from the flames of the crematoria, from the concrete of the